Hi, thank you for being here, especially during the World Cup and England is playing. So what is it like to have a body? Nagel first asked, what is it like to be a bat? To explain the idea that we cannot easily access someone else's experiences, but also to convey the idea that for something to have an experience of a body, someone would have to have an organism, someone would need to have a body. So I want you to think about what is it like, for instance, to be an octopus? What would it be like to have 8 jelly arms? It's quite difficult to think, but it might be also difficult to imagine what it would be like to have 4 normal human arms. Later, Matthew Longo and colleagues paraphrased Nagel to say, what is it like to have a body? When they uncovered the components of embodiment. Even if it might be hard to think of what it's like to have a jelly arm of an octopus, it might likewise be hard to explain what is it like to have a hand. Suppose you are communicating with a being with no body. How would you describe what is it like to have a body? How would you describe what is it like to have a heart, a foot, a finger? This might be quite hard, also because the body is linked to our sense of self. I move my body and I see my body moving, and I feel that this is my body, and I sort of feel that I exist in this space. And I have these sensations and I can control this body. But we can also think about the body as this boundary between the self and the world, or the boundary between ourselves and everyone else. But less likely we think about our body as a 3D object. But indeed, we are a 3-dimensional object, and bodies, as any other object, have a volume, a weight, and a density. So today, I'm going to talk to you about, the first part will be about the supernumerary body. Supernumerary refers to having more body parts than the ones we have. So the case, for instance, of 6 fingers or extra arms. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about the real body. How do we perceive the physical properties of our own body? So we do have a map of the body in the brain. That was the first idea that excited me before coming into neuroscience. How come we have a map of our own body in the brain, and why do we need one? And even though we know that we need this map of the body to sense and to move our body, we still do not know exactly how these computations come to fruition. So for instance, an aspect of this body map is that it's quite persistent. So even in the case of the phantom limb of someone who lost a hand, they exhibit the same distortions that we all have about our own body. And in a recent study, the Tamar Makin's group discovered that people who lost a limb still have a very persistent representation of the hand area. It could be that other areas took over, but after 5 years, they remained intact, despite not having feedback from the hand, not sensations or motor commands. So it's quite persistent. So what happens when the body changes? How does our brain adapt to it? In the very classical rubber hand illusion, we were able to test the perception of existing body parts for over 20 years. And this is because in our field it's quite hard to test body perception, because we cannot simply remove a hand and put it back. So we need to use these tricks to understand how the brain is indeed perceiving the body. And for many years we use this illusion to try to understand how we are perceiving our own body. But how do we test the perception of extra body parts? The rubber hand illusion was also very successful in octopuses. So what happens is that if you stimulate a fake arm at the same time as the real arm, both in people and in octopi, they come to perceive this extra arm as part of their body. But why this is so interesting for us is that octopi is the closest that we have on Earth to an alien, because we share a very distant ancestor. And yet, we developed the same strategy to identify our body, which is this synchronous visual tactile stimulation, and other type of modalities can also induce it. So what happens when we gain a limb? With this experiment, we were able to test the perception of real body parts, but what happens if we gain a limb? Can our brain cope with perceiving an extra body part? So Roger Newport, which I think it's the Houdini of neuroscience, created the fabulous Anne-Boleyn illusion that I've been working with for the last years. In the Anne-Boleyn illusion, he created a momentary illusion of having a sixth finger. And with it, even before my PhD, I developed a version that made it last in time. So I developed a continuous illusion of having a sixth finger. And this was very helpful in two ways. One, it shows that the brain can endure a representation of an extra finger. But at the same time, I have now a paradigm that I can use to test the perception of extra body parts. Because if it lasts in time, I can now manipulate a few features. So how does this illusion work? It uses the Ramachandran mirror box illusion. The idea of Ramachandran was that his hope was to treat phantom limb patients. The idea is, if you look in the mirror and you have the mirror midline your body and you see your hands, then it feels like it's the contralateral hand, the reflection in the mirror. Unfortunately, it wasn't very efficient to treat phantom limb, but it was a powerful illusion. Because with this illusion in experimental psychology, we are able to split what we feel from what we see. Because on one side of the mirror, you can see your hands, and we can manipulate something else on the other side. And for the brain, it looks like it's happening in the same place. So this photograph illustrates very well the mirror box illusion. It seems like the hand is on her thigh, but then we look that the real hand is actually on the top of the head. But if now she would look in the mirror, would turn a bit around and look in the mirror, she would have this weird sensation that her hand was actually on her thigh, because visually that's what she would see. But her proprioception, so the sensors from the muscles, would tell a different story, that the hand is actually up. But the brain cannot have both at the same time. It has to come up with a solution, hence we can generate new illusions with this. So how does it work, the six-finger illusion? We touch each finger synchronously, and on the last touch, what the participant experiences is a real touch that happens on the real finger, but is mapped onto empty space. Because as they look in the mirror, they see a touch happening in empty space. And what is interesting is that this gives rise to a very vivid and instant sensation of having a sixth finger. And this sensation of a sixth finger can be sustained over time throughout the stroking. So it shows that we have the ability to experience extra fingers, because otherwise the illusion would just vanish. We would not perceive it. Then I went to see how far we can go, so I tested a long six-finger illusion. So visually we would see a longer six finger and a short six finger, and participants are just as happy with a finger in a different length. But what is interesting though, is that they feel the six finger with a different length at the same time that the actual fingers are in a normal position. So this shows that we can have an independent representation of the supernumerary finger. Even though the touch occurs on the actual hand and it's in this normal position, the real fingers can be felt in one position and with one length, while the extra finger can have a different size. But as we grow, indeed, our body changes, our body grows, but the shape is more or less the same. It's not common that we suddenly gain another hand or that the shape of our fingers change. So then I tested shape, And I asked participants to judge what was the perceived curvature of the finger. And what we found again is that they were able to perceive the sixth finger curved. So here in the y-axis you see the curvature angle, and this is just the perceived judgments. While the actual finger was perceived a bit round, because we do have some natural curvature around 35, but not in the same curvature angle. Again, this shows a flexible representation of the supernumerary finger. Also because our fingers cannot do that shape. So that means that it's not only that it can have an independent shape, but also it can be anatomically incongruent with the actual fingers. So then the natural next step would be to look at posture. And this is because we know from rubber hand illusion studies, a hand that is positioned at 90 degrees from the hand cannot induce the illusion. So the illusion of feeling that the rubber hand is part of our body through visual synchronous strokes just vanishes at 90 degrees, which makes sense because our proprioception has information that the hand is indeed not in that position. Therefore, the rubber hand cannot be my hand. But this would be true for actual body parts. And if indeed what this illusion is tackling into is into a supernumerary body part, then it shouldn't be a problem that it is in a different position, in the same way that your left hand can be in a different position from the right hand. So to test the limits of the perception of extra body parts, I induce an extra finger in different angles of orientation, around 2 angles of rotation. And as you can see in orange and in blue, you can see the several angles, and the last plot is the control condition. So all the angles up to 180 degrees were able to induce the illusion of having a sixth finger. And here you can see, so we also asked them what was the felt location of the extra finger, and indeed you can see for the blue plots, the sixth finger increases as the curvature induces, as the position induced also increases, but not for the little finger. Again, showing this independence from the actual finger. But what is more important here is that this shows that perceiving extra body parts does not have the same constraint as for real body parts. There's a clear difference between perceiving the body and perceiving extra body parts. It seems that we are more flexible for extra body parts. And then we extended this paradigm to people with anorexia, and we induced extra fingers in different positions. The idea to do this study is also because people with anorexia in previous studies have exhibited higher flexibility to embodying the rubber hand illusion. However, in our case, the level of embodiment was the same, was very high level, maybe because it's quite a strong illusion. But what we found is that for the perceived location of the extra finger, there was a consistent difference. People with anorexia felt the extra finger consistently less rotated than healthy controls for all the conditions. So this shows that it's not just about high flexibility, but that is actually a posture constraint in anorexia, which also shows that just representing an extra finger, this flexibility we might have for it is quite different from the flexibility we might have for its posture. They're 2 different constructs. And I also was interested in whether this could be applied to action. So we feel a sixth finger. We know it's invisible. We know it's not there. It's just something we are perceiving. It's just a sensation. Does it change how we perceive the hand? Does it change what we feel we can do with that hand? So what I asked was, after inducing the extra finger, I asked them to choose the smallest aperture that they feel they could fit the hand through, and also the biggest square they feel they could grasp. And what we found is that after the illusion, they indeed choose a bigger aperture and a bigger block to grasp. But what is more interesting is that this is regardless of reporting feeling a sixth finger. So we split the sample, we had 50 participants, we split them into people perceived the sixth finger and people who did not report perceiving the sixth finger. But regardless, they chose a wider aperture, probably without noticing, because it's very, very small sizes. It also shows that the sixth finger is perceived as part of the hand. It could be that you just have a sensation of a finger, but it's indeed changing how you perceive the hand, up to the level that it also changes your affordances. So it seems that this illusion is quite strong, and indeed that we have higher flexibility for perceiving extra body parts. There's no need to match the actual finger's position, size, shape, or even anatomy. It makes sense. It may be beneficial to have higher flexibility for a novel body part. We never had this body part, so we need to learn how to use it. But is it really because it is an extra body part? So in science, I have to go against my own hypothesis and think, could it be that it's something else about this illusion? For instance, in this case, the illusion is invisible, whereas a rubber hand, you see a real rubber hand there. The other difference is that it is a finger. Is it because it is a finger? Well, to address the idea of the invisible hands, Guttersam and colleagues did the invisible hand illusion, in which case they stroke a real hand at the same time as a visible space. But when this illusion is made at 90 degrees from the real hand, the illusion vanishes. So this shows that no, it's not because it is invisible. Is it because it is a finger? Well, indeed, fingers have different numerosity. We have 5 fingers on each limb. It's different in size, they are smaller, and also we have overlapping motor representations for us to be able to coordinate and have higher dexterity. So it could be that it's more prone to confusions indeed. So I created an extra arm illusion where we have to stroke the extremities of the arm in empty space at the same time as the other hand, and the participant, what they see is just the experimenter stroking empty space, and they feel a touch on the real arm that is mapped onto this empty space. And then I induced at different angles of rotation, and again, it was a bit lower, but participants were able to perceive the extra arm in all angles of rotation. So you can see the retention for the finger at 180 degrees around 85%, and for the arm lower 54%. And here we can see the perceived rotation of the fingers. So indeed, for the arm, we can also experience the arm in extreme orientations. So it's not because it is a finger, it is possible to recreate this illusion for the arm. So what are the limits? So we wanted to go a bit further, and in this master student project, what we did is that we induced the extra finger using someone else's finger. And mind, we are not hiding the person and leaving just a finger out. The person is just sit next to the participant, and then we induce the illusion. And still, participants were able to perceive very differently from the control. So it was lower, but they were still able to perceive as part of their body. But what was more interesting is that we then asked them, the sixth finger belonged to each body. And in the y-axis, you can see 0 belongs to other and 100 to the self. And for all the conditions, so for the normal sixth finger, then the other sixth finger, where you use someone else's finger, and then the other upwards is someone else's finger, but the hand is rotated. In all of them, participants judged this extra finger as belonging more to the self than to the other. And then we touch the other person's finger and ask, what about this finger that clearly belongs to someone else? This finger belongs more to which body? And in that case, they indeed categorize as belonging to the other, but a bit less so in the other six finger condition. So this shows that this illusion is able to blur the boundary between the self and the other. Of course, participants do know that it's not their finger, but they perceive it as belonging to their body. It's so strong, this visual synchronous stimulation, that it makes them have this perception that someone else's finger belongs to them. And I want to bring you a bit of mythology to introduce the idea that extra arms and extra digits and even extra hands were already prevalent in some cultures. So in the case of the Durga, it acts beyond human limits. In the Avalokiteshvara, it's able to see more and to reach further. And if you notice, each arm has a different tool. So the idea is that they were able to move each tool differently and do more. But then in the Greek mythology, is now seen a bit as excessive force. Indeed, it's still beyond the human abilities, but it's too excessive. And this is a nice portrait of the Hecatonkairos, because the idea is that he would have, it's an entity that has 3 beings, and within this entity there's 50 heads and 100 arms. So it's a bit more grotesque. I bring you this to introduce the idea, can we cope with extra body parts? Or is it indeed excessive? There's this idea that extra body parts would be extra abilities. Indeed it would, if we can still control our real limbs without any deficits. Will it change how we control the real limbs? And I haven't solved this question, but I'd like to introduce the study by Kelly, but the famous robotic 6-finger. And what they found is that there was a reduced cortical dissimilarity after around 2 weeks of using a robotic 6-finger. What does this mean is that it's typically a marker for reduced motor control. So does this show a limit to supernumerary embodiments? Well, it does show that the brain is indeed changing and adapting to this robotic, simple extra finger that can be used in daily activities. But will it impact how we can coordinate and use the other existing limbs? And now, to help answer this question, I bring evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. We humans had a 5-digit reduction, all tetrapods have. So there were species with more than 6 fingers, with 6 fingers and more, up to, I think, 8. And we had a reduction. So there was an evolution moment where we were reduced to 5 fingers. This means that no tetrapod can have more than 5 digits on their limbs. But you might say, well, I know that some species do have 6 fingers. I've heard, for instance, the yai has 6 fingers. Indeed, but it's not a real finger, it's a pseudo thumb. Indeed, our genetics will not allow us to develop extra fingers as a species. However, in some studies, we're able to induce it, in this case, can be genetically induced an extra whisker. Whiskers are a bit of parallel in mice for fingers in the sense that they use it to perceive the environment, and they are massively represented in the brain, called barrels in the somatosensory cortex. After inducing an extra finger, they developed a contralateral barrel, which means a specific area to represent this extra whisker. In humans, there are also individuals with 6 fingers. This is a family in Brazil that was studied by Mering and colleagues. And this family, they are very proud of their extra finger, and they are able to do all sorts of activities. And what they tested is that they are indeed better than 5-finger individuals at playing the piano. They can tie 1 shoe with just 1 hand. And critically, they developed an area in the somatosensory cortex for this extra finger. And of course, they developed dedicated muscles and dedicated nerve fibers to use this extra finger. And it's actually a thumb, so it's very helpful. That means that you can also use it as an abduction and then do something else with the rest of the fingers. So in this case, extended abilities were actually allowed. It did not reduce how well they cope with it and how well they perform with the existing fingers. It enhanced their abilities. And this overall shows that the somatosensory cortex can adapt to supernumerary body parts. So as the summary of the first part, but we have more, the representation of extra body parts can be quite flexible and independent from the actual fingers. It can change the action affordances, what we think we can do with those with the fingers and with the hands. And it's distinct from the representation of existing body parts, and also it can blur the self-other boundaries. So now we're going to move to something quite different that I also developed throughout the PhD, which is, and I want to bring you back to this idea of the object, of the body as a 3D object. We are a three-dimensional object with a volume, a density, and a weight. But how do we perceive these properties about our own bodies? Indeed, there's decades of research about how we perceive the weight of objects, but very little research in how we perceive our own body. So why does this matter? Well, prosthetic users do report feeling the prosthesis as too heavy, even when these prostheses can be made with materials that are actually lighter than the real limb. Stroke patients also complain that they feel like the paretic limb is like a weight that they are carrying rather than a body part. This famous quote from Louis Pasteur, "It is like lead, if only it could be cut off." And space flight. We do know that going into space, we can experience altered gravity. If it's in the International Space Agency, for instance, a space station, we can experience zero gravity. So the feeling of weightlessness, suddenly we do not feel the weight of our body anymore. Astronaut Scott Kelly, when he returned for a one-year mission at the ISS, he said, "It's like I weigh 1,000 pounds, because suddenly our vestibular system is telling, again, more information about the body, and in 1G gravity, it all comes back." So we used psychophysical staircase that was developed by Matt and Elisa to measure how we perceive hand weights. The way that it works is that we place a weight on the wristband, and in each time we ask whether it feels lighter or heavier than your hand. And the idea is that if I ask you how many grams is your hand weight, we don't have a clear sense of how much a gram is. So in this case, by comparing with an object, we can have a quantification of perceived hand weight. So what you see there is the trial number. One staircase starts at 600 and the other at 200, and they quickly meet around trial 8, as you can see here in the average. This is the perceived weight, around 200 grams of participants. And this is their actual weight of the hand. And this difference is the level of underestimation, around minus 49% for these participants. So this shows that we perceive our hands much lighter than what they are. We perceive it around 200 grams, like the weight of a kitten, when in fact it's around a can of tomatoes. This means we're walking around with 2 cans of tomatoes in our hand and we don't perceive it as such. Indeed, if you just move your hand up now, you'll see it's very easy to do it. We have this intuition that we do not fully perceive the weight of our body. And this makes sense because in a 1G gravity on Earth, if we perceive the full weight of our body, it would be too strenuous to walk around. But if that's the case, then when we are more tired, when we need to rest, when the body needs to signal for homeostasis, then this underestimation should reduce. And this is exactly what we found. So here we have the pre-test, and then we fatigue the hand, just the hand alone, but really fatiguing. And in the post-test, it's still underestimated, but now you can see in the post-test that this underestimation is reduced. So it seems that this may be a fundamental parameter to promote action, and that's why when we are tired, then we need to promote rest. But we do know that there are systematic distortions in hand size and shape. So could it be that we perceive our hand lighter just because we may perceive it as smaller, for instance? So to test this idea, we did the psychophysical staircase for hand weight and the psychophysical staircase for perceived volume using cubes. Why cubes? Because we want an abstract idea of the hand and not just a visual matching task. What we found was actually that we perceive our hands to be overestimated, again, in terms of weight, underestimated, and this means that we can now compute perceived density and it's also greatly underestimated. This means that we feel our hands to be as light and as dense as foam beads, as if they would float in water. So what about the foot? This is, for now, I've been talking about the hand and these manipulations to hand weights. But could this be that it's because it's the hands and we need this higher dexterity, and there's also cortical magnification for hands? Could it be that feet also has this underestimation? Indeed, they developed from a shared anatomical plan, so they may be similar in some ways, but at the same time they specialize for different functions. And if you think about it, they have different weight functions as well, different weight duties. So hands, typically we do maneuver things, yet our feet need to sustain the whole weight of the body. So we did the same paradigm. So we tested again hand weight and foot weight, and we find a similar level of underestimation, and they are positively correlated. So again, the same underestimation of hand and feet weight. And then we wanted to modulate it. And the reason for this is that we don't have a sensor that signals for body weight. Our brain has to compute it. So we need to find strategies to understand how our nervous system is computing perceived hand weight and perceived foot weight. We know from the literature, for instance, in the size weight illusion, this is for objects. If we hold two objects of the same weight and one is bigger, we perceive the bigger one as being lighter. Agard and Yundi reproduce a similar effect. So if by enlarging a hand, the same weight is now perceived to be heavier. And this is because the hand is perceived heavier. Now the object is perceived as smaller. Because it's smaller, it's heavier. So the same size weight illusion for objects. But what about the body? We don't know how we would perceive the body if the volume changes. So of course I used mirrors and brushes to induce the feeling of having a larger hand and a smaller hand, using magnifying and minifying mirrors. So if you see in the figure, by looking at the mirror, you see your hand, your contralateral hand, as being smaller than what it is throughout the whole procedure. And then we test the same psychophysical staircase, and what we found is that even though underestimation was still maintained for the three conditions, we can now see a nice linear trend, where we go from around 40% of underestimation to around 35%. So this shows that when we perceive a bigger hand, we also perceive it as heavier. And this sounds very intuitive, sounds very banal. If you tell someone that there's this scientific research that shows this, everyone will find it, well, obvious. But that's not the case, because for objects it's exactly the opposite. So this shows us a specific mechanism for the way we perceive body weight and body density that is different from the way that we perceive objects. Of course, the body is a very special object in our mind. And with this, we created the constant density model, which is the second one. So the first would refer to the constant mass model, which is not what our results support. And in this model, in the constant density, it means that when the hand is perceived to be bigger, it's just perceived to be made of the same hand stuff. Hence, it will be perceived as heavier, because imagine if you have a hand, it would be made of the same blood and arteries and bones. This is how the brain is computing this change. So it changes volume, it changes weight, but it maintains density as constant. It could be the way around, which would give rise to the opposite perception, which is what is happening for objects. So summary for the second part about the real body. How do we perceive the physical properties of our body? Well, we greatly and dramatically underestimate hand and foot weight. It seems that this is a very fundamental parameter to promote action. This is specific for the way that we experience our bodies. It's not something fundamental about, it's not an error in the way that we compute weight, because we are very accurate when we perceive the weight of objects. It's a fundamental parameter to promote action. We also show a density underestimation at the same time as a volume overestimation. We perceive the hands slightly bigger than they are, but definitely much lighter than what they are, and ends much less dense than the real hands. Showing this constant density model, which is a cue for how the brain is computing perceived body weight. So in general, with these two trends of research, I show that the way we perceive our bodies is quite flexible. And also, we never existed without a body. There is something very fundamental about having a body. And the body is indeed this very special object in the brain. And with it, not only it's flexible to experience extra body parts that can have all these types of shapes and postures, but also we here show the consistent distortions about our body. And before we finish, I'd just like to say a word about my supervisors. So in academia, I think one of the things that we can be very proud and honored by is that we get to work with the people that we like. But when we choose a supervisor and we are juniors, we don't always know what we're going to get. And when I read Matt's articles, I was fascinated, but I didn't know that he was going to be the best, kindest person with the most brilliant mind. And throughout the years, I've had the honor to work with him, which is another great thing about academia. And throughout these years, I've just come to admire him more and more. And I also would like to say thank you to Elisa. I gained Elisa as my second supervisor in the middle of my PhD. And she's just a fabulous person, so generous and so creative. And with her, what I've learned is the value of hard work. So every time I'm in a difficult position, I think I need to channel Elisa's fierceness and strength. And everyone who knows her knows what I'm talking about. Also, I've worked with so many amazing people, and I cannot put the photos of everyone, but I really appreciate everyone that worked with me, but also that I've met throughout the years, and I'm really thankful for you to come and see my talk. And I'd like to thank Birkbeck, and also I'd like to thank EPS, that has been a very special institution throughout these years. In my research, I was able to present my research. It funded my research stay in Madrid. And I just always felt so embraced from the beginning. And I remember the first time I came to a talk. And the idea that now I'm on the other side is just unbelievable. Thank you so much for today.